The first time I told my husband I didn't want to do something, I was shaking. Not because I thought he would hurt me, not because I expected a raised voice or a punishment handed down in the cold, measured language of consequences. I was shaking because I was 31 years old. And in 24 years of living inside that community, I had never once strung those words together in that order and aimed them at another person who had the power to change something about my life. I don't want to. In the mouth of most women, barely worth a pause. In mine, after 2.5 decades of old colony Mennonite life, in the flat, wide farmland of southern Manitoba, something close to an earthquake. I was standing in the kitchen of our farmhouse. It was early spring. The light was coming in pale and horizontal across the linoleum floor, the kind of thin morning light that doesn't warm anything yet, just illuminates it. The coffee was hissing on the wood stove behind me. I said it, and then I stood very still, the way you do when you have said something that cannot be unsaid, waiting to find out what the room would do in response. The room did nothing. My husband looked at me, and what happened in the space that followed, what he did and what he did not do, what I felt, and what I was forced to understand, told me more about the life I had been living than everything I had managed to put together before that morning. My name is Naomi, and this is Naomi outside the colony. I grew up Old Colony Mennonite in rural Manitoba, Canada, and this channel is where I say the things my community never allowed me to say out loud. It is where I find the words for experiences I lived through before I had language for them. It is where I try to be honest about what was taken from me and what I am still, slowly, learning to reclaim. If what you are about to hear is the kind of thing you have been searching for, not just information, but recognition, the feeling of someone finally naming the thing you have been carrying without a name, please subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss what I share next. It means more than I can say to know you're here. Now, let me tell you what no one ever told me. When people outside Old Colony life hear that Mennonite wives are expected to submit to their husbands, they tend to imagine a specific picture. They see a man commanding and a woman flinching, a door with a lock, an obvious structure of control visible from the outside, something you could point to and call by its name. That is not what it looks like. That is exactly what makes it so difficult to see. What it looks like is a Thursday in November, a woman who has been awake since before 5 in the morning, who has already started the bread, already put feed out in the frozen dark for the animals, already packed the lunch pails and set the table, and swept the floor of a kitchen that will need sweeping again before noon. A woman who will not sit down between the rising of the sun and the setting of it except to fold her hands in prayer before meals. Who has learned through something deeper than instruction that wanting things for herself, wanting things beyond the good functioning of her household and the smooth maintenance of her husband's peace, is not the kind of wanting that belongs to her. What it looks like is not a prison. It looks like a woman who was never told there was anything outside the walls. I need you to stay with me through this next part because it is the hardest part to say and the most important thing I know. I want to tell you about 3 things I was taught before I ever entered a marriage. I was not taught them in any classroom. I was not given a list. I was taught them the way you teach a child that a hot surface is dangerous before they have words for heat, through the structure of everything around them, through the daily repetition of a world organized on certain assumptions until those assumptions become the shape of reality itself. By the time I was old enough to question any of it, I had already swallowed it whole. The first thing I was taught was that a wife's purpose inside marriage is service, not expression. The word that organized our community's understanding of a good woman was demut, humility, but not the humility of someone secure enough to listen, someone generous enough to consider a perspective different from their own. This was a structural, total humility, the humility of someone who understands that her own interior, her opinions, her preferences, her private certainties about how things ought to go, is not what the structure is built for. The structure is built for the family, for the husband's leadership, for the community that depends on everyone holding their assigned shape. Her thoughts are not wrong. They are simply not the point. I want you to understand that if you had walked into any home in our community and asked the wife whether she had a voice in her marriage, she would have said yes. Most of them believed it. I believed it. Because when every marriage you have ever witnessed operates on the same hidden architecture, one person's word carries the decisions, the other person's job is to make peace with them and call that peace agreement. You do not know there is any other kind. You think the conversation you are having is a real conversation. You think being consulted before a decision is already made is the same as actually influencing what is decided. You think a husband who asks your opinion and then does what he planned to do anyway is practicing mutual respect. You have no reference point for anything different. So the walls are invisible. That is not an accident. The second thing I was taught was that disagreement inside a marriage is not a communication tool, it is a spiritual failure. Old colony theology is built around the gathered church, the believing community moving together in one direction under God's established order. And God's order inside the home flows through the husband. He is not understood as a tyrant. He is understood as a steward, a spiritual caretaker, someone entrusted with something holy. His wife's deference to his leadership is not really obedience to him as a person. It is participation in something sacred, the way she enacts her faith at the most private level of daily life. The word for the disruption of that order was hochmut, pride. And I grew up hearing that word applied to women who express themselves too clearly, too often, with too much expectation that expressing themselves would change anything. Not vain women, not arrogant women. Women who believed their own perspective deserved a seat at the table where decisions were made. Women who made the mistake of saying, I see it differently, when the matter had already been settled. Hochmut was spoken about with a quiet sadness, as if the woman in question had disappointed herself as much as anyone else. And I absorbed it, the way children absorb everything that is repeated around them, with enough consistency and enough seriousness that a woman who held her opinions softly, who offered them gently and without insistence, who accepted her husband's conclusions with visible peace, was good. A woman who held her opinions clearly, who offered them with the expectation that they might actually change something, was failing at something important. By the time I was grown, I could not have told you where that belief had come from. It was not a belief, it was a floor. The third thing I was taught was that a woman's happiness inside marriage is a byproduct, not a goal. I want to be very careful here because I do not think the people who taught me this were cruel. I do not believe my mother, who lived this teaching with more grace than I ever could, wanted the women around her to suffer. She genuinely believed, I think most of the women in our community genuinely believed, that the deepest peace available to a woman ran through surrender. That the more fully she released her own agenda, the more completely she gave herself to her role without reservation or complaint, the more she would find a contentment deeper than anything she could have constructed on her own terms. Endurance was not presented to us as a burden. It was presented as formation. The woman who carried difficulty patiently was not being wronged. She was being refined. And here's the hardest thing I have to tell you about this teaching. For a long time, I believed it. Not because I was naive or weak, but because the water runs so deep and moves so slowly when it is all you have ever swum in. The act of swallowing your own needs begins to feel like spiritual practice when every voice around you has always called it that. The feeling of making yourself smaller begins to feel indistinguishable from grace. You do not know what has been taken when you were never shown what you were supposed to have. I want to tell you about something that happened in the second year of my marriage. Something small. Something that would barely register to someone who had never lived inside that world and would mean everything to someone who had. We were discussing whether to sell a piece of farm equipment and lease additional acreage from a neighboring family. My husband had been thinking it through for several weeks. He brought it to the dinner table one evening in the particular way he had of presenting things that were already decided, not as proposals exactly, but as conclusions moving toward confirmation. He was not asking me whether. He was telling me what, and waiting, I think without knowing he was waiting, for the soft agreement that was the only response he had ever received. But I had been doing the arithmetic quietly, in the way I did most things, in the seams between other tasks, without drawing attention to the thinking itself. I had been listening to conversations after Sunday service, watching prices, paying a kind of attention I had never been given credit for, And I had a different sense of the situation. Not dramatically different, not a crisis, just a quiet, clear feeling that the timing was wrong, that a better arrangement existed if we waited a season, that the plan on the table was going to cost us more than it needed to. I remember sitting at the kitchen table that evening. The kerosene lamp was between us, the way it always was, throwing that warm, slightly amber light that makes everything look like memory even while it is still happening. I remember the shape of the thought in my chest. I remember opening my mouth and then closing it, and looking down at my hands folded on the table in the posture I had sat in my entire life. The posture of a woman who is receiving, who is present but not pressing, who is there to support whatever is being decided, not to redirect it. I did not say anything, not because he would have been angry, not because there would have been consequences in any visible form, not because anything would have happened at all in any obvious sense, but because something in me, something that did not feel like a thought, that felt like a fact of the world, like the color of the walls or the direction of the road, simply did not believe that I was permitted. The belief was not something I had chosen. It was something I was standing on without knowing it was there. We went ahead with his plan. And for weeks afterward, I carried my unspoken thought the way you carry a stone in a coat pocket, occasionally reaching for it in quiet moments, turning it over, feeling its weight, setting it back, wondering sometimes what would have happened if I had let it out, finding no answer I could use. This is what submission looks like from the inside. Not a hand raised or a voice raised or a door locked from the outside, just a woman at a table with a thought already folded up and put away, making that decision so automatically, so completely without friction, that she barely registers making a decision at all. If something in what I'm describing feels familiar to you, not because you grew up in my community, but because you grew up somewhere that taught you your voice was a problem, your wanting was a burden, your needs were more than what was permitted, please subscribe and follow this channel. I share these stories every week because I know I am not the only one who needed them. And I needed them for a very long time before anyone started saying them out loud. Now I want to tell you the part that surprised me most, the part that still catches me, even now, years outside that life. Years of therapy, years of slowly building a way of existing in the world where I'm allowed to take up the actual space I occupy. Most of the men inside that system are not cruel. I need to say that carefully, and I need you to hear it carefully because I know it is uncomfortable and I know there are real cases of cruelty within traditional communities, and I am not dismissing a single one of them. But the men I grew up watching, my father, my husband's father, the elders and ministers and deacons of our Gemeinde, were not the majority of them bad men. They were not scheming to diminish the women in their lives. They had been shaped by the same community, handed the same theology, given the same marriage before they were old enough to understand what a marriage was supposed to be. They were taught that a good husband leads, that his leadership is a spiritual responsibility, not a personal preference, that the wife who defers to him is honoring something sacred, and that this deference is a gift she is giving to God through him, not something taken from her. They were taught that a quiet wife is a contented wife, that a woman who does not complain is at peace, that if she needed something, she would say so. And because the women are so completely trained to give no signals of distress, because they have spent their entire lives practicing the art of needing nothing in any visible way, of carrying difficulty quietly, of asking for less than they need, and calling the space between what they need and what they ask for a form of spiritual discipline. Because of all of this, the men often genuinely cannot see what is happening. They look at the capable woman, the efficient woman, the woman who wakes before them and manages everything around them and never complains, and they see contentment. They do not know about the thought she folded up and put away at the kitchen table. They are not aware of the stone in the coat pocket. They have never been shown what her silence actually contains. I sat in a therapist's office in Winnipeg about 8 months after I'd left. It was a small office with a plant in the window that was doing better than I was. I described the table, the lamp, my hands, the thought I had swallowed without even registering the swallowing. I described carrying it afterward, the way it had sat with me for weeks, a residue I couldn't quite account for. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What you're describing isn't submission, it's self abandonment. And the difference matters enormously because submission is something you choose. Self abandonment is something that happens when the capacity to choose has been removed before you were ever old enough to know it was supposed to be yours." I came apart a little sitting in that small office. Quietly, because that is the only way I know how to fall apart. The training does not stop at the borders of grief because she was right. I had not been practicing faithfulness. I had been practicing disappearance. And I had practiced it for so long, with such completeness, in such thorough isolation from any other model of what a woman's inner life could be, that I had stopped knowing it was a practice at all. It had become indistinguishable from my nature. And the difference between a practice and a nature is the difference between something that can be unlearned and something that defines you forever. It took me a long time to believe I was practicing. It took me longer to believe I could stop. I want to pause here and be honest about something I know some of you are thinking. You're thinking, but some women choose this. Some women find genuine meaning in a marriage organized around traditional roles. Some women enter that kind of partnership with full information, full freedom, and a genuine capacity to leave if they needed to. And those women's choices are real and belong to them. You are right, and I agree. What I am describing is something different from that. What I am describing is a system that removes the capacity to choose before the question of choice is ever raised. That shapes a girl from the beginning of her understanding to believe her desires are evidence of spiritual weakness. Her opinions are hochmut. Her discomfort is something to be offered up rather than addressed. And her silence is the highest form of faithfulness available to her. That marries her at 18 or 19, before she has any reference point for what another kind of life would feel like. Before she has met a single woman who has chosen differently and found it good. Before she has one word for what is happening in her own interior. A genuine choice requires real options. Options you can see, touch, hold in your mind long enough to imagine belonging to you. The young women I grew up alongside were handed one life and carefully, tenderly, completely taught to call it everything. I left when I was 24. I have told that story in other videos, and I will tell more of it in the ones that come next. But what I want to say here is what the leaving taught me about how deep the conditioning had gone. The shunning was not dramatic the way outsiders imagine. No public announcements, no ritual separation. What there was a gradual withdrawal, a cooling of voices I had known my whole life, a thinning of contact until contact became almost nothing. My mother called once, about 3 months after I'd gone. We talked for 9 minutes. She asked whether I was eating well. She said the weather had turned cold. She said she prayed for me every morning, which I believed because she was a woman who prayed for everything she loved. And then she said, very gently, in the way she said everything, my mother had a voice like something laid carefully on a surface, never dropped, that she hoped I would find my way back to what was true. I am not telling you this for sympathy, though I understand if sympathy is what you feel. I am telling you because it shows how complete the world I had left behind was. My mother was not a villain. She was a woman who loved me with everything she had available to love with, and who could not see outside the structure she had inhabited her whole life any more than I could see outside mine before I was forced to. We were both in that phone call doing the only things we knew how to do. We were both in different ways working with what we had been given. Even after I left, I did not leave cleanly. That is important to say. I had my own apartment in the city. I had a job, then a better job. I had a therapist who was helping me build language for things I had lived through without vocabulary. I had, slowly, cautiously, a small community of people who had grown up in similar worlds and were navigating the same particular disorientation. The strange vertigo of being free to want things and not knowing how to start. And still. The instinct to make myself agreeable arrived before I had decided whether I agreed. The reflex to apologize as the opening line of any sentence in which I needed something. The habit of scanning every room for the correct amount of space for me to occupy and then, automatically, taking up slightly less. The way mild disagreement, even on something small, even with someone I trusted, produced an anxiety in my chest that was wildly out of proportion to the situation because it was calibrated for a different situation entirely. It was calibrated for a world where a woman's disagreement meant failing something sacred. You carry the water with you when you leave the river. The river does not chase you. It is already inside you. It lives in the way you hold your shoulders in a difficult conversation, and in the extra syllables your no grows when you are nervous, and in the way you thank someone for receiving a correction before you have decided whether the correction was accurate or fair. I am not telling you this cannot be unlearned. I am telling you it takes longer than you expect and costs more than you budget for. And it requires you to extend to yourself a patience you were never once taught was warranted. Now, let me tell you what I didn't tell you at the beginning. The morning I stood in our kitchen shaking and said, I don't want to, I told you my husband looked at me without anger. What I didn't tell you was what he looked at me with instead: relief. He looked at me with the unmistakable expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for something they did not know how to ask for. And then, after a moment, he said quietly, I've wanted to know what you actually think for a long time. I did not know what to do with that sentence. I stood in the early spring light with the coffee hissing and tried to hold what he had just said and figure out what shape it had. He had wanted to know what I thought. He had wanted, probably longer than either of us understood, to be in a marriage where both people were genuinely present. And I had been trained so completely to give him the version of me that fit the structure that he had been making decisions inside a silence I had created, believing, as he had been taught to believe, that my quiet meant my peace, that my agreement meant my agreement. We were both in that kitchen, understanding something neither of us had the words for before that morning. We could not save the marriage. I want to say that plainly. We were too far inside something that needed more than two people trying harder, more than good intentions, and a single brave conversation. But that morning, standing in the spring light with my hands no longer quite shaking, I understood something I have thought about almost every day since. The system does not only take from the women, it takes from the men the chance to be genuinely challenged, genuinely questioned, genuinely known by the person closest to them. It takes from them the chance to be wrong and grow from it. It takes the chance for faith to be something chosen in full light, rather than inherited in the dark and performed for a lifetime without examination. It takes the chance for two people to build something that actually belongs to both of them, something that has both their shapes in it. It takes so quietly that most people inside it never hear what is being removed. They feel it sometimes as a heaviness without a name, a loneliness that makes no sense given how surrounded they are, a weariness that prayer is supposed to heal and somehow doesn't quite reach. But they have no frame for what the absence is an absence of, so they carry it without being able to set it down. If you grew up being told that your silence was your virtue, I see you. If you were taught that wanting things for yourself was selfishness and that needing things was a kind of weakness you should be ashamed of, you are not alone in that. If you have ever sat at a table with a thought fully formed in your chest and folded it up and put it away because something old and deep and invisible told you that you were simply not allowed, I see you. You were allowed. You have always been allowed. The fact that no one ever showed you that, the fact that the world you were handed was built so carefully to make sure that allowance never occurred to you, that is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of what was done to the space where your worth was supposed to live. If something in this reached you today, please subscribe and like this video and turn on the notification bell so you're there for what comes next. I have so much more I haven't said yet. I have only just started saying it, and I will be here every week saying more. Let me say one last thing. No theology I am willing to inhabit, no faith tradition, no community, no set of teachings I would agree to build a life around requires a woman to stop existing as a whole person in order to qualify as a good wife. No genuine spirituality asks for her erasure as evidence of her faithfulness. Whatever submission means in its truest, most honest form, whatever it looks like when two people freely and clearly, with full information and real alternatives, choose to structure their shared life around something larger than their individual preferences. That thing, whatever it is not silence. It is not a woman who has been shaped so carefully and so completely from so early that she can no longer remember wanting things out loud. It is not one person and their reflection sitting across a table in the light of a kerosene lamp, believing the reflection is a partner. Silence is not faithfulness. Silence is just silence wearing faithfulness as clothing. A marriage in which one person has lost and or was never given the ability to say what she thinks and wants and needs is not a holy covenant. It is a hollow one. And the hollowness hurts everyone inside it, not only the person who has been made small. What I wanted, once I had found words for what I wanted, was not to escape commitment. It was not to reject the idea of building something together, something durable, something that outlasts convenience and comfort and the easier choices. What I wanted, what I had always, even inside that life, been reaching toward without understanding that reaching was permitted, was to be in the room, actually in the room, present as a person, not performed as a role, heard, not just listened to, known, not just managed. I am still learning what that looks like. Most days, I am still learning I am allowed to find out. Until next time, find your voice. It was never as dangerous as they told you it was.